Right now, at this very moment, millions of American families are feeling the squeeze at the gas pump, at the grocery store, and in every corner of their household budgets. Fuel prices across the United States have been climbing at a pace that is alarming economists, frustrating consumers, and putting enormous pressure on the White House to act fast and act decisively. And today, we have a major development to report. The United States government is moving to ease a century-old shipping regulation in a direct bid to bring fuel prices under control. And the ripple effects of this decision could touch every single person living in this country. Whether you drive a car, heat your home, run a small business, or simply buy food at a grocery store, what we are about to tell you matters. So do not touch that remote because the next 30 minutes could save you real money and help you understand one of the most consequential policy moves happening in Washington right now.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to U.S. Benefits Update. I am your host, Claire Hollister, and if you are new to this channel, welcome. We are so glad you are here. At U.S. Benefits Update, our mission is simple. We track the government decisions, policy changes, and economic updates that have a direct impact on the financial lives of everyday Americans, and we break them down in plain, clear language so that every single viewer understands exactly what is happening and what it means for them personally. Today, we have an update that is genuinely significant, and it connects directly to something you have almost certainly been feeling in your own wallet. So let us get into it right now.
The breaking news today is that the United States government is preparing to ease restrictions under the Jones Act, one of the oldest and most debated maritime shipping laws in American history, in a targeted effort to increase the domestic supply of refined fuel products and help bring down the spiraling energy costs that have been punishing American consumers for months. This is not a minor regulatory tweak. This is a significant policy move that experts say could have real and measurable effects on the price Americans pay for gasoline, home heating fuel, diesel, and the countless other products whose prices are tied to the cost of energy. The administration is expected to issue waivers that would temporarily allow foreign-flagged vessels to transport fuel between American ports, bypassing a requirement that has been in place since 1920 and that has long been criticized for artificially limiting domestic fuel supply and driving up costs for consumers. The details of exactly how broad these waivers will be, which routes they will cover, and how long they will remain in effect are still being finalized. But the signal from Washington is clear. The government is taking the fuel price crisis seriously, and it is willing to use every available tool to address it. To truly understand why this decision is being made right now and why it matters so much, we need to go back and look at the full picture of what the Jones Act actually is, where it came from, and why it has become such a lightning rod in the current debate over energy prices. The Jones Act, formerly known as the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, was signed into law more than 100 years ago in the aftermath of the First World War. The law was designed with a very specific national security purpose in mind. Following the war, American policymakers were deeply concerned about the country's ability to maintain a robust domestic shipping industry that could support military operations and supply chains in times of conflict. The law requires that any goods transported between two United States ports must be carried on ships that are built in the United States, owned by United States citizens, registered under the American flag, and crewed by American workers. This applies to all waterborne cargo moving between domestic ports, including fuel, food, construction materials, vehicles, and virtually everything else that moves by sea within the country's borders.
For over a century, the Jones Act has been fiercely defended by the domestic maritime industry, labor unions representing American sailors and shipyard workers, and national security advocates who argue that maintaining a viable domestic fleet is essential to the country's strategic interests. And those arguments are not without merit. A strong domestic maritime industry does provide real national security benefits, and the jobs it supports in shipyards and aboard vessels are real, well-paying American jobs. But over the decades, critics of the Jones Act have mounted an increasingly compelling case that the law comes with serious economic costs that fall disproportionately on American consumers. Because the requirement that ships be American-built, American-owned, and American-crewed significantly limits the number of vessels that can legally carry goods between domestic ports, there are far fewer ships available for domestic routes than the market would otherwise support.
Fewer ships means less supply of shipping capacity, and less supply of anything tends to mean higher prices. This dynamic plays out most visibly and most painfully in the fuel market. Consider what happens when a refinery on the Gulf Coast of Texas produces gasoline or heating oil that needs to be transported to consumers on the East Coast. Under the Jones Act, that fuel can only be loaded onto a qualifying Jones Act vessel. But here is the problem. There are not very many of those vessels. The United States Jones Act fleet has shrunk dramatically over the decades as the economics of building and operating ships in the United States have become increasingly challenging compared to international competitors. The result is that sometimes, rather than sending fuel directly from the Gulf Coast to the Northeast by sea, energy companies find it cheaper and more logistically practical to export the fuel to a foreign port, transfer it to a foreign vessel there, and then import it back into an American East Coast port. Think about that for a moment. American fuel, produced in America, sometimes takes a detour through a foreign country before it can legally reach American consumers by sea, all because of a law designed to support the domestic shipping industry. Critics argue that this kind of inefficiency is baked into the system by the Jones Act, and that it contributes directly to higher fuel costs for American families. The problem has been particularly acute in certain regions of the country. New England, for example, is heavily dependent on heating oil to keep homes warm during winter, and the region's fuel supply is significantly affected by Jones Act constraints on coastal shipping. Puerto Rico, which is a United States territory and therefore fully subject to Jones Act requirements, has been one of the most vocal critics of the law for years, with island officials and economists arguing that it forces residents to pay substantially more for fuel and other goods than they would in a free market. Hawaii faces similar challenges, and during periods of high national fuel prices, the constraints imposed by the Jones Act ripple out to affect consumers far beyond just those coastal and island communities. Now, the current administration has been under intense pressure to act on fuel prices from multiple directions.
Inflation has remained stubbornly persistent, and energy costs are one of the biggest drivers of that inflation. When fuel is expensive, the cost of transporting everything goes up, and that cost ultimately gets passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices for food, clothing, electronics, building materials, and virtually every other product that moves through the supply chain. Exhales sharply. The White House has been looking at every available lever to address the situation, and the Jones Act waivers represent one of the more direct and immediately actionable options on the table. Previous administrations have used Jones Act waivers sparingly, typically in response to natural disasters or acute supply emergencies. The decision to use them in response to broader fuel price inflation is relatively unusual and signals the seriousness with which the current administration is treating the energy cost crisis.
Now, who does this decision directly affect, and who stands to benefit from the easing of these shipping restrictions? The honest answer is that virtually all Americans stand to benefit in some way, because fuel price relief has such broad and far-reaching effects throughout the economy. But let us be specific about the groups who will feel the most direct and immediate impact. First, and most obviously, consumers who drive vehicles. Gasoline prices are the most visible and personally felt manifestation of the energy cost crisis, and anything that increases the supply of fuel flowing through the domestic distribution system has the potential to put downward pressure on pump prices. Even a reduction of a few cents per gallon matters to families who are filling up their tanks every week and watching those dollars
Add up. For a family with 2 vehicles that each fill up once a week, a 10-cent reduction in the price of gasoline translates to roughly $300 in annual savings. That is real money, particularly for working families who are already stretched thin. Second, households that depend on heating oil or propane to heat their homes, particularly in the Northeast and Upper Midwest, stand to benefit significantly from improved fuel distribution. Home heating costs have been a serious financial burden for many families over the past several years, with some households reporting heating bills that have doubled or even tripled compared to what they were paying just a few years ago. Increased supply flexibility through Jones Act waivers could help ensure that fuel reaches these regions more efficiently during high-demand periods, potentially moderating the price spikes that have been so damaging to family budgets. Third, small business owners across virtually every industry would benefit from lower fuel costs. Whether you are a restaurant owner managing food delivery costs, a contractor whose crew drives to job sites every day, a farmer running equipment and transporting goods to market, or a retailer receiving inventory from distribution centers, your operating costs are tied directly to the price of fuel. Size. When fuel costs go down, margins improve, and those savings can be passed on to customers or reinvested in the business. Fourth, transportation and logistics workers, including truck drivers, delivery workers, and others whose livelihoods depend on keeping operating costs manageable, would benefit from lower diesel prices that make their work more economically viable. It is important to be transparent about who might be negatively affected by the easing of Jones Act restrictions, because a complete picture requires acknowledging the trade-offs involved. American maritime workers and shipyard employees have legitimate concerns about what expanded access for foreign vessels could mean for their industry and their jobs. The Jones Act has been a cornerstone of the domestic maritime labor market for over a century, and any relaxation of its requirements, even a temporary one through targeted waivers, creates uncertainty for workers in that sector. The administration has indicated that it is sensitive to these concerns and that any waivers issued would be carefully scoped to address the specific fuel supply bottlenecks driving prices higher without broadly undermining the domestic maritime industry. But workers and their union representatives are watching this situation closely, and their voices deserve to be part of the conversation. Size. Let us talk about the timeline, because one of the most important questions on everyone's mind is how quickly these changes could translate into real relief at the gas pump and on home heating bills. The administration has signaled that it wants to move quickly on this, and the mechanics of issuing Jones Act waivers do not require congressional approval, which means the executive branch can act on its own authority and on a relatively fast timeline. Curious. Once waivers are formally issued, the practical effect on fuel supply would depend on how quickly energy companies can arrange to bring additional foreign-flagged vessels into the relevant trade lanes. Shipping is a complex, global industry with its own logistics and lead times, so the transition from policy change to actual increased fuel delivery is unlikely to happen overnight. Industry analysts suggest that the first measurable effects on regional fuel supply could begin to be visible within weeks of waivers being issued, with more substantial impacts developing over the following months as shipping arrangements are put in place and scaled up. The administration has also indicated that it is coordinating with the Department of Energy, the Department of Transportation, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to ensure that the regulatory changes work in concert with other policy tools to maximize the impact on fuel prices. There may also be additional measures announced in the coming days and weeks that complement the Jones Act waivers, including potential releases from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, coordination with state governments on fuel distribution infrastructure, and engagement with domestic energy producers to encourage increased output. The picture that is emerging is one of a multi-pronged approach to the fuel price crisis, with the Jones Act waivers being one significant piece of a broader strategy. As for how long the waivers would remain in effect, the current indications are that they would be time-limited and subject to review based on market conditions. The administration would likely monitor their effect on both fuel prices and the domestic maritime industry, and adjust the scope and duration of the waivers accordingly. Curious. What are the experts and observers saying about this move? The reaction has been predictably varied, reflecting the complexity of the issue and the genuine tension between the short-term goal of bringing down fuel prices and the long-term interests of the domestic maritime industry. Economists and energy analysts who have long argued for Jones Act reform have largely welcomed the decision, viewing it as an overdue acknowledgement that the law's costs to consumers are real and significant. Analysts at several leading energy research firms have noted that targeted waivers for specific fuel routes, particularly those serving the Northeast and other regions with limited pipeline access to domestic refineries, could meaningfully improve supply flexibility and help moderate price spikes during periods of high demand. Thoughtful. Some economists have gone further, arguing that the administration's willingness to use Jones Act waivers in response to inflation pressures creates an opportunity to have a broader public conversation about whether the law, in its current form, still makes sense in the 21st century energy landscape. Consumer advocacy groups have expressed cautious optimism about the move, welcoming any action that could provide relief to families struggling with high fuel costs while calling on the administration to be transparent about the expected magnitude and timing of the price effects. Several groups have also used the announcement as an opportunity to push for more comprehensive and permanent reforms to domestic fuel pricing policy, arguing that temporary waivers, while helpful, do not address the underlying structural issues that make American consumers vulnerable to fuel price volatility. Maritime industry representatives and labor unions have expressed their concerns clearly and forcefully, emphasizing the importance of the Jones Act to American national security and to the livelihoods of tens of thousands of maritime workers. They have called on the administration to ensure that any waivers are truly temporary, narrowly targeted, and subject to rigorous oversight. Some industry voices have also challenged the premise that the Jones Act is a major driver of current fuel prices, arguing that global oil market dynamics, refinery capacity constraints, and pipeline infrastructure limitations are more significant factors. This is a legitimate point of debate, and the actual effectiveness of the waivers in reducing prices will ultimately be the most important test of the policy. Political observers have noted that the decision reflects the enormous pressure the administration is under to demonstrate that it is actively addressing the cost of living concerns that have been weighing heavily on American households. Energy prices are one of the most politically sensitive economic indicators, in part because they are so visible and so personally felt. Every trip to the gas station is a direct, tangible reminder of what fuel costs in a way that many other economic metrics are not. Curious. The administration is clearly betting that the political and economic benefits of being seen to act decisively on fuel prices outweigh the political costs of friction with the domestic maritime industry and its allies. Whether that bet pays off will depend significantly on how quickly and how substantially the waivers translate into real price relief for consumers. Let us now talk about the real human impact of all of this, because at the end of the day, what matters most is not the policy debate or the political calculations in Washington. What matters is what this means for real people living real lives across the United States of America. Thoughtful. Think about the single mother in Providence, Rhode Island, who drives 45 minutes each way to her job every day, and who has watched her weekly gasoline bill climb steadily higher while her paycheck stays the same. Every extra dollar she spends at the gas pump is a dollar that does not go toward her children's school supplies, her grocery bill, or the small emergency fund she is trying to build. For her, even a modest reduction in fuel prices is not an abstraction. It is a real, concrete improvement in her family's financial situation. Think about the retired couple in rural Maine who rely on heating oil to keep their home warm through the long winter months and who have been receiving their fuel delivery bills with a sense of dread as prices have climbed year after year. For them, the prospect of lower heating costs is the prospect of financial breathing room in a retirement that was already carefully budgeted before inflation started chipping away at their purchasing power. Think about the small fleet owner in the trucking business who has been watching diesel prices eat into margins that were already thin and who has been faced with the impossible choice of raising his rates and potentially losing customers, or absorbing the cost increases and watching his business become unviable. For him, any improvement in diesel prices is a direct improvement in the viability of his livelihood. Size. Think about the grocery store owner in a mid-sized city who has been dealing with higher delivery costs from distributors, higher utility bills for refrigeration and climate control, and customers who are already price-sensitive and increasingly frustrated by what they see on store shelves. For her, lower energy costs throughout the supply chain could mean the ability to hold prices steady or even reduce them, which would benefit both her customers and her bottom line. These are not hypothetical scenarios. These are the realities that millions of Americans are living with right now, and that is why the government's decision to use every available tool to address fuel prices is so significant. There is also a broader economic picture worth considering. When energy costs are high, they act as a tax on economic activity. Businesses spend more to operate, consumers have less money to spend on other goods and services, and the overall pace of economic growth slows. Conversely, when energy costs come down, the effect ripples through the entire economy in positive ways. Businesses can invest more in growth and in their workers. Consumers have more disposable income to spend, which supports jobs and economic activity across a wide range of industries. Farmers can manage their operating costs more effectively, which can eventually contribute to lower food prices. Airlines, which are enormously sensitive to jet fuel costs, can potentially stabilize or reduce fares. The potential economic benefits of meaningful fuel price relief extend far beyond the direct savings at the gas pump, and that is why this policy decision deserves serious attention from anyone who cares about the economic health of the country and the financial well-being of American families. Thoughtful. Before we wrap up, let us also acknowledge something that often gets lost in these discussions, which is the connection between energy prices and the communities that are most vulnerable to economic stress. Low-income families spend a disproportionately high share of their income on energy. The burden of high fuel prices falls harder on people who have less financial cushion, people who live in areas with limited access to public transportation, people who work jobs that require them to drive long distances, and people whose homes are less well insulated and therefore require more energy to heat and cool. When fuel prices go up, the pain is not evenly distributed. Size. And that means that when fuel prices come down, the relief is also not evenly felt, but it flows most meaningfully to the people who have been hurt most. That is a reason to take seriously any measure that has the genuine potential to bring energy costs down for American consumers. Let us now bring all of this together with a clear and comprehensive summary of everything we have covered today, because we want to make sure you leave this video with the full picture firmly in mind. The United States government is preparing to ease restrictions under the Jones Act, the century-old maritime shipping law that requires goods transported between American ports to be carried on American-built, American-owned, and American-crewed vessels. The decision to issue waivers allowing foreign-flagged ships to carry fuel between domestic ports is a direct response to the spiraling fuel prices that have been squeezing American consumers and businesses for months. Size. The Jones Act has long been criticized for limiting domestic fuel supply by restricting the number of vessels that can legally service American coastal trade routes, and the waivers are intended to introduce more supply flexibility into the system and help bring prices down. The primary beneficiaries of this action would be everyday consumers who drive vehicles and heat their homes, small business owners across all industries, transportation and logistics workers, and the broader American economy, which functions more efficiently when energy costs are manageable. The timeline for price relief is measured in weeks to months rather than days, as the logistics of the shipping industry require some lead time to translate policy changes into actual increased fuel delivery. Experts are divided on the magnitude of the expected impact, but many energy analysts believe targeted waivers for high-demand routes could provide meaningful relief, particularly in regions like the Northeast that are most exposed to Jones Act constraints. Curious, and the broader political and economic context is one in which the administration is under significant pressure to demonstrate action on inflation and cost of living concerns, making this a move with both economic and political dimensions. If you have been feeling the pinch of high fuel costs in your own life, you are not alone, and the government is clearly aware of the problem and taking steps to address it. We will be watching this story closely and bringing you updates as the waivers are formally issued, as market conditions evolve, and as the actual effects on fuel prices become clearer. Curious. This is a developing story, and there is more to come, so please make sure you are subscribed to this channel so that you do not miss a single update. And speaking of that, if you found today's video helpful and informative, we would be so grateful if you would take just a moment right now to show us some support. Hit that like button below the video. It takes 1 second and it makes an enormous difference in helping this channel reach more people who need to hear this information. Subscribe to U.S. Benefits Update if you have not already done so, and make sure you tap the notification bell so that you are alerted every time we post a new video. We cover Social Security updates, Medicare news, government assistance programs, tax relief, inflation-related policy changes, and everything else that affects the financial lives of everyday Americans. Size. There is a lot happening in Washington right now, and we are committed to making sure you stay informed about all of it. And please, leave a comment below and tell us what you think about this Jones Act update. Are you hopeful that it will bring real relief? Are you concerned about what it means for American maritime workers? How have high fuel prices been affecting your own life and your family? We read every single comment, and your perspective matters to us and to the broader community of viewers who come here to stay informed. Share this video with someone in your life who needs to hear it. A friend, a family member, a neighbor who you know has been struggling with high energy costs. Encouraging. A simple share can make a real difference. I am Claire Hollister. Excited, this has been U.S. Benefits Update, and we will see you in the next video. Stay informed, stay engaged, and encouraging. Keep looking out for one another.